Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, Respect at Work, the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces. My name is Julie-Ann Guivarra and I'm the Australian Ambassador for Gender Equality. Firstly, I would like to begin this conversation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm mindful that people listening to this webinar may find some of its content distressing. If you are, please reach out to support services in your jurisdiction, such as a hotline or online services, or reach out to a person that you trust. And if you are in danger, please contact emergency health services in your location. As I said, this webinar discusses the Respect at Work report, which highlights the findings and recommendations of a landmark national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australia's workplaces. Of course, we've all witnessed the groundswell of support internationally for the Metoo movement and support for survivors. Unfortunately, workplace sexual harassment and discrimination exist in every industry and workplaces across the globe. As Australia's Ambassador for Gender Equality, I advocate internationally for women's equal participation in political, economic and social affairs and promote gender equality and leadership and decision-making at all levels. Both gender equality and women's economic empowerment are priorities for Australia's foreign policy, our economic diplomacy and development efforts. As we all know, sexual harassment is rooted in gendered social norms and inequalities. Australia is working domestically and internationally to address these issues, which affect not only the individuals, but are also major costs to business and societies. In addition to the national inquiry, which will be discussed shortly, Australia's national plan to reduce violence against women and their children 2010 to 2022 includes measures to prevent and respond to sexual violence and sexual harassment. At an organisational level, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is committed to preventing and addressing sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment through our Preventing Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment policy, which was released in 2019. Without further ado, today we will hear from two speakers on this particularly important topic. Kate Jenkins is Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, leading the Australian Human Rights Commission's work on sex discrimination. Kate led the national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australia's workplaces, and we look forward to hearing her experiences in developing the report. Our second speaker is Dr. Purna. She is UN Women's Executive Coordinator and spokesperson on addressing sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination. Established in 2018, the Office of UN Women's Executive Coordinator and spokesperson on addressing sexual harassment works to advance the rights of victims, survivors of sexual harassment wherever they are, and to promote cultural change needed to end this form of discrimination. I hope you will find this discussion useful as we collectively work towards the elimination of sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination in our workplaces.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm so pleased to see so many of you have registered for the session today. I'd start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from, the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And from wherever you are across the world, I encourage you to take a moment to pay your respects to the traditional owners of the land on which you are located. Today is one of a series of webinars on our recently released Respect at Work report on the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in the Australian Workplaces. Each webinar has focused on different stakeholder groups, and today our focus is on the implications to international stakeholders. Unfortunately, Ambassador Julie-Ann Guivarra has not been able to join us today, and we miss her insights We know she will be following along, but it is fantastic that we have my colleague Purna with us as we unpack the Respect at Work report. And I thank Julie-Ann for her support to get this webinar up and running. So please be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available to share with others in the next week or so. And I'm mindful that people listening to this webinar might find the content distressing. So please remember that there are support services available should you need them. In Australia, 1800-RESPECT or 000 if you're in immediate danger. Thank you for the questions you've posed ahead of time as well. You can send through questions anytime using the Q&A function located either on the right of your screen or at the bottom. And it looks like a text message symbol. And the Q&A is pre-moderated, so there may be a short delay before your questions appear. Participants can also turn on live captioning if you require via your settings, which are indicated by the 3 dots either at the right or at the bottom of your screen, and choosing turn on live captions. So now to introductions. Many of you will know that I am the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner. I started in this role in 2016 and have worked on a number of significant Australian Human Rights Commission projects since that time, including working with universities, with defence and play by the rules. And as I'm sure you all know, I've spent the last 18 months finalising Australia's first national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. And today I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Purna Sen. Purna, I'll just pass to you to quickly introduce yourself before I make some additional opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Kate, and a pleasure to be with you. I'm Purna Sen. I lead UN Women's work to end sexual harassment and look forward to sharing more about that with you in a moment.
Thank you, Purna. I look forward to hearing your remarks. So the format of today will be I will make some remarks giving an overview of the inquiry and our report, which, as some of you will know, is a substantial document, nicely tagged, but also just for those who are interested, the resources will be in the tag. The executive summary is lovely, slim and very elegant to read. I'll make some comments and then I'll pass to Dr. Sen to give her remarks, looking particularly at the experience of sexual harassment across the world. And then we will take your questions as we go. So I encourage you to post questions, as I've already mentioned. To set the scene, firstly, I'll give you a few kind of context settings. This is the definition of sexual harassment under the Australian Sex Discrimination Act. At its simplest, sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, which reasonably causes the person harassed to be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. Similar definitions are used across the world. Our national inquiry focused on sexual harassment at work. And some of you will know that at the same time in 2019, the International Labour Organization also established a convention called Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. In 2018, the Metoo movement placed a renewed spotlight on the prevalence of sexual harassment at work, internationally and in Australia. And the same year, we commenced our national inquiry in Australia with the support of government, unions and employers. The global context was a critical factor in the Australian government's interest in action, and also we had really strong sponsorship from the then Minister for Women, the Honourable Kelly O'Dwyer. This work occurred in the backdrop of my key priorities as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, which was reducing violence against women, advancing women's economic security and promoting women's leadership, which are also the priorities in Australia for the Department of Foreign Affairs in its work and for our Federal Office for Women. And what we realised with the inquiry was that sexual harassment affected all of those priorities. It was an issue of violence against women. It was an impediment to women's economic security, and it was also a significant barrier to promotion of women into leadership roles. So this reinforced the widespread appetite for change. The goal of the inquiry was to examine the nature, prevalence and drivers of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces, and to measure and measures to address and prevent it. Our Respect at Work report is the culmination of 18 months' work involving a survey of 10,000 workers, 60 public consultations with 600 participants, 460 written submissions, global research and economic modelling. I launched Respect at Work alongside the Minister for Women, Senator the Honourable Marise Payne, on Friday the 6th of March. Minister Payne is also our Minister for Foreign Affairs, and so this webinar is a perfect combination of all her portfolios. Minister Payne and the Attorney General, the Honourable Christian Porter, welcomed the report and said the Australian Government would carefully consider its recommendations. And they also underlined the government's commitment to ensuring Australian workplaces are safe and free from sexual harassment. Many participants in the inquiry shared with me their devastating experiences of sexual harassment at work and also the inadequate responses they faced. Most heartbreaking was the long-term harm and financial hardship caused by the experience, and I know Purna has heard those stories in abundance as well. We found that sexual harassment is a common experience. Our survey and inquiry told us that workplace sexual harassment is pervasive. It occurs in every industry, in every location, and at every level in Australian workplaces. In 2018, 1 in 3 Australian workers had experienced workplace sexual harassment in the last 5 years, up from 1 in 5 workers in 2012. We found the current system places the onus on the victim to complain, and yet we know that only 17% of people who said they were sexually harassed at work made a complaint. We found that sexual harassment happens in all workplaces. Our 2018 survey collected industry-specific data for the first time across 21 ABS-defined industry sectors, which provides a valuable resource for industry action. And we also found that sexual harassment has a high cost. Deloitte Access Economics modelled the economic cost of workplace sexual harassment for the inquiry. They estimated that workplace sexual harassment cost the Australian economy $3.8 billion in 2018. Overall, it became clear that the current system for addressing workplace sexual harassment in Australia is complex and confusing for victims and for employers. Our inquiry revealed an urgent need to shift from the current reactive complaints-based approach to one that requires positive action from employers and had a focus on prevention. Our Respect at Work report proposes a new approach which builds upon Australia's existing policies and initiatives through 55 recommendations which were directed across government, business and the not-for-profit sector under 5 key areas of focus. Firstly, data and research to deliver useful industry-based information about the nature of sexual harassment and effective responses. Secondly, primary prevention of sexual harassment through education, media and community-wide initiatives. Third, a refocused legal and regulatory framework which recognises the mutually reinforcing roles of discrimination, workplace and safety laws. Fourthly, better workplace prevention and responses, which are leader-driven, practical and adaptable. And fifthly, better support, advice and advocacy for people who experience sexual harassment. And I'll just show you, this is an overview of that new workplace framework. Chapter 6 describes the promising practice in workplace actions across 7 domains, which includes leadership, culture, transparency, measurement, education, support and reporting. And that chapter in particular drew strongly on the work of UN Women led by Purna. Over the course of our inquiry, we conducted global research, and I also visited China, Brazil, New York, Hong Kong and Thailand to share our work and also to learn about practices in those countries. For today's webinar, I wanted to share 5 lessons learned from our inquiry, aligned to these 5 areas of focus that I've already described that might be useful in an international context. The first one was about data, and particularly our National Prevalence Survey. Data has been a critical linchpin for the momentum on sexual harassment in Australia. Respect at Work relied on our 2018 National Survey of the Prevalence, Nature and Reporting of Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces. This was the 4th in a series of surveys that the Australian Human Rights Commission has conducted periodically since 2003 on our national experience of sexual harassment. Our national surveys are an important source of data, both on the nature of the problem and on the likely effectiveness of solutions. For example, the industry-specific data collected in 2018 allowed us to identify which industries had the highest reported rates of sexual harassment and provide an evidence base for industry-specific targeted action. We recommended Australia continue to conduct a national survey every 4 years to allow trend analysis to inform both policy decisions and employer initiatives. We also recommended that Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, known as ANROS, established a national sexual harassment research agenda to ensure we continue to collect evidence to eliminate sexual harassment. I would encourage other countries to consider running a similar regular national prevalence survey to inform their own policies. Even if a national prevalence survey is not possible in your country, it is helpful for individual industries and professions to conduct their own industry-wide surveys to identify industry-specific issues and design targeted solutions. Such surveys should be developed using international best practice. Our survey, which is available in our 2018 Everyone's Business report in the resources link for this webinar, is an excellent place to start. The next area of focus was primary prevention. Our inquiry revealed that the primary driver of sexual harassment is gender inequality. Of course, other cultural, intersectional and systemic factors also contribute. Understanding that it is power imbalances within societies rather than just a few bad apples behaving badly, which are driving sexual harassment, is a crucial first step to eliminating it. Instead of being reactive, we need to be proactive and we need to think big to eliminate sexual harassment. We need to eliminate gender inequality. As a result, one of our key findings in Respect at Work was that it is essential to fund the primary prevention of sexual harassment. Primary prevention refers to initiatives that target the whole population and aim to transform the key drivers of violence against women, including sexual harassment, so that the violence or harassment does not happen in the first place. We recommended that the Australian Government ensure that its primary prevention initiatives use the Change the Story framework for primary prevention of violence against women and children, which again you can find in the resources link for this webinar. Change the Story underlies the importance of recognising and shifting the gender drivers that underpin violence against women, including sexual harassment, and of promoting gender equality. In Australia, our primary prevention work addressing violence against women our primary organisation addressing violence against women is a national organisation called Our Watch, whose chair is Australia's current CEDAW committee candidate, Natasha Stott-Despoja, who has been very much supported by myself our Minister for Women and Minister for Foreign Affairs, and also our Ambassador Julie-Ann Guivarra. And I hope and believe that Natasha's online today. So hi, Natasha. Another good example of effective primary prevention identified during the inquiry is Australia's Respectful Relationships Education. Respectful Relationships Education is provided to young people through schools and focuses on developing children's understanding of gender inequality and respectful, non-violent relationships. We recommended that this education be rolled out uniformly to all children in Australia and explicitly include a focus on sexual harassment. The next area was the legal framework, and in Australia the three main legislative schemes that regulate sexual harassment in the workplace are the anti-discrimination laws, employment regulations and work health and safety laws. Our inquiry concluded that the interaction between these three schemes is confusing and sometimes inconsistent for workers and employers. However, we found that there are significant benefits to each of these regimes, which are well recognised across Australia. We made a broad range of recommendations designed to strengthen and clarify these frameworks so that they can work in a complementary and mutually reinforcing manner. Our recommendations included changes to the laws governing sexual harassment, the introduction of a legal positive duty requiring all employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate sex discrimination, sexual harassment and victimisation, and proposed changes to our labour and work health and safety schemes. Each country's legal framework is unique, but our legal and regulatory recommendations are still highly relevant because they illustrate how important it is to examine your local legal framework when you're taking steps to tackle sexual harassment. Do your laws make sexual harassment unlawful? Do they treat sexual harassment solely as a criminal offence or solely as a workplace, human rights or safety issue? Is sexual harassment only picked up when it leads to or becomes sexual assault? Do your laws impose obligations and consequences on employers independent of individual complaints? Does the law cover sexual harassment in all forms of work and in all areas of public life? The inquiry revealed that instances of sexual harassment can fall through the gaps if the different elements of a country's legal system are not working together to ensure that sexual harassment is prohibited and punished no matter what form it takes or in what context it occurs. While only a small percentage of victims do complain, it's critical that the law unambiguously prohibits sexual harassment. We made other recommendations that also create incentives for good practice, including public reporting to our Workplace Gender Equality Agency and guidance from the Australian Stock Exchange. Next, we focus on sexual harassment as a systemic workplace issue. The fourth takeaway from the Respect at Work report that I want to highlight is how important it is to recognise sexual harassment as a systemic issue rather than a matter of individual misconduct. Focusing on particular individuals, incidents or organisations in isolation and only after a complaint arises has been ineffective. As already mentioned, we developed a new workplace framework that places responsibility for prevention on sexual harassment squarely on employers. We identified positive progress where there was collective industry action, including through the use of industry-based prevalence data, agreeing common standards, sharing training content, and improving response options. Industry action is particularly effective because it can address systemic factors that exist across the whole industry. Collective initiatives can address systemic factors which increase the risk of sexual harassment and reduce the chance of complaints. For example, quite topical in Australia at the moment is the legal sector, where we've identified that there's a hierarchical structure, there's short-term or indirect working relationships, long hours and high levels of social interaction, gender inequality in leadership, and high competition for opportunities. Our report covered examples of industry action in universities, medicine, media and entertainment, retail and hospitality. And finally, we focused on protecting and supporting all workers. My last takeaway is about the importance of ensuring that all workers are protected from sexual harassment. This includes workers recognising the changing nature of work, including work in the informal economy, casual workers, workers in other forms of insecure employment, client-facing workers, and workers facing intersexual challenges. Coverage needs to also cover workers' aspects of their working life that haven't traditionally been covered, such as their online activity. It's of significant concern in Australia that the rates of image-based abuse recorded by our e-Safety Commissioner in Australia are up more than 200% since the start of COVID-19, when working from home, where possible, became mandatory in many parts of Australia. That is also why we recommend a holistic approach to support services for victims to ensure that vulnerable workers are able to access information, advice and assistance. In Australia, working women's centres in some states are an excellent example of such an accessible and holistic model working well. So our world has changed dramatically since our report was tabled in the Australian Parliament on 5th of March. COVID-19 has changed the immediate priority for governments and workplaces around the world, and rightly so. However, the need to address sexual harassment has not lessened, as all too frequent headlines in each of our countries continue to demonstrate. Government and workplace leaders around the world already have, in our comprehensive report, the information they need to take action to create more productive, respectful and safe workplaces. Our report is focused on Australia, but as I hope I've shown today, its implications are so much broader than any one country. So Purna, now I look forward to hearing your reflections on the report, and I also encourage participants to continue to send in questions for Purna and I to answer after her address. Over to you, Purna.
Kate, thank you very much. That was a really helpful and comprehensive, I think, overview of the work that you've been doing, and I'd like to come to that in a moment. We agreed that I would also explain my role in the work we're doing. I hope that will be the glue between our two presentations. So let me start, if I may, by just explaining my role and the work I'm doing, and then I'll come to some comments on your initiatives there. So first of all, my role was created in 2018 at UN Women to pick up on the global conversation which really exploded in 2017 around sexual harassment. Of course, we know about the Metoo movement. I think everybody has that on their radar, and it's quite right to recognise that spontaneous victim and survivor-led explosion really did change a global conversation and pushed sexual harassment right up the public policy and practice agenda. I want to recognise that, and I'll come back to it in a moment, but I'd also like to recognise that movement has a longer history, not least of all in the phrase Me Too, or the term Me Too, which was coined by Tarana Burke, an activist in the US who has worked on issues of sexual violence and minority and Black and poor communities, but also has its antecedents in broader movements and actions against violence against women that go back for decades. So it's in that historical context I'd like to place not only my role, but I think the work that we're all doing. I'd also like to recognise that sexual harassment is not an issue only in Australia or in the US, where it's had a lot of publicity, but it really is a global concern. And that's why UN Women as a global organisation, an international governmental organisation, has a profound interest in changing the landscape. Let me quickly share one or two pieces of information about that global experience. Work in parliaments in Europe found that across parliamentarians in 40 countries, 25% experienced sexual violence. This is parliamentarians. 15% experienced physical violence. The African Union recognized sexual harassment and sexual violence within their organizations. A staff survey in the United Nations itself found that a third of of my colleagues reported sexual harassment in the previous 2 years. In fact, if you look at what the survey also found, looking across their whole lifetimes of working in the UN, the reporting rate rose to almost 40%, I think it was 38%. In Bangladesh on campus, there had been work done around sexual harassment and violence, and there were rules and laws introduced, but just 2 years ago, 87% of students on campus were unaware of the guidelines against sexual harassment, which had been issued 9 years previously. I won't go on and on and on, but there is, I think, a very sound basis for saying this is a global problem and we need to learn globally how to deal with it. We have been looking at what was happening on Twitter around the Metoo movement, and we'll be sharing that information in a short information handout next month. But let me quickly say to you, just looking at Twitter, one social media channel, between 2017 and 2019, there were over 25 million impressions on Twitter using the hashtag #MeToo. The global resonance of this conversation, I think, cannot be overstated. For those who are interested in listening in Australia, you had 260,000 impressions on Twitter in that period. At UN Women, what we've tried to do in my role is to look at what sexual harassment is, how it manifests, what we can do to address it, and start to set up some standards, what we call standards, about work intended to eliminate it. We talk about sexual harassment as a human rights violation, a creature of gender inequality that intersects with other forms of inequality. Let me explain that. The primary dimension on which sexual harassment works, and Kate has talked about this to some extent already, is a dimension of gender inequality and sex inequality. It is primarily perpetrated by men against women, but anybody can be a victim or a target of sexual harassment. Yet we know that the patterns of sexual harassment tend to follow the contours of inequality. So racial inequality, inequalities around disability, sexual orientation, age, indigenous status, and many other factors which determine how power is distributed socially, help to define who is particularly targeted, and I have to say also who is particularly excused or believed if they are accused of sexual harassment. For me, intersectionality means we need to look at both who is targeted and who is excused, who enjoys the privilege of belief and who suffers the stones and the harms of allegations of malice and malicious reporting. If you look at those patterns, you can see that sexual harassment is an expression of discrimination and inequality. It's not about a random accumulation of microaggressions. You can see, if you look at data, and that's why this sort of evidence is very important, you can see there are certain groups who are particularly targeted more than others. And so for that reason, we see it as an expression of structural inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality, and many other dimensions too. And we think about sexual harassment on a whole range of spectrum. We talk about it from looks to words to contact to sexual assault to rape. And I do mean that whole spectrum. Sometimes people say, why looks? Because if you're at work and your colleagues or your supervisors spend the whole time looking at your bust or your backside, then there is something else going on there that is not appropriate in the workplace or in the university or elsewhere. And we certainly want to ensure that rape and sexual assault are understood in that broader spectrum of behaviours and attitudes that constitute sexual harassment. Because of this, because of understanding this as a human rights violation, because of understanding it as a form of discrimination and inequality, we're very clear that there are international legal standards and mission commitments that are relevant to this work. Let me just point out a couple, and we talk about these as international normative standards. Understanding that sexual harassment is a form of discrimination which mostly targets women, We call on and we look at the Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination as a founding piece of legal architecture. Almost all countries in the world have committed to ending this form of discrimination. Under that, CEDAW, the committee that looks after this law, has understood and has explained that sexual harassment and other violence is a form of discrimination. So we have a commitment to end that. Let me also mention the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by states across the world in 2015. They have a number of goals and targets. In there are several that are pertinent to this discussion. One, SDG 5.2, talks about the elimination of all forms of violence against women, and it gives a timeline. This has to be done by 2030. What's that, just 10 years away? What a big job we have to do. So there are other goals there, and I'll come back to one in a moment, which are pertinent to this discussion. But what I want to take from that is that we're not talking about reduction or mitigation. The language used by our governments for many years has been about elimination and ending and eradicating. That is the vision of the governments. That is the call that women and others who have been subjected to harassment or violence in other forms have made for many years and for many lifetimes. And that's the objective we must keep in mind. So what I've been doing in this role is to try and set more practice and policy standards and understandings that we can all work to. We have looked at what constitutes effective policy and practice against sexual harassment, and I'm just going to refer to some of our publications. We've set out what this might look like in a publication called Towards an End to Sexual Harassment. I'll just wave it briefly. And there we have some extremely helpful advice from our own advisor on ending sexual harassment, Professor Catherine McKinnon. In our second publication, we go beyond the procedural, the practice and policy climate to look at the context in which these practices sit, the cultures in which we are all embedded, the beliefs we bring to work and to university, the ways in which we respond to when people speak about what's happened to them. And that is explained in this publication called What Will It Take? Promoting Cultural Change. And I think this is what, Kate, you referred to earlier, where we talk about prevention in much more detail. I just want to say that we have gone into two expressions that are used a great deal in work to end sexual harassment. One is zero tolerance and one is victim-centered approaches. And what we try to do is give some meaning, some substance to what these terms actually look like if they're put into practice. And the third thing I want to highlight is that not only are those two expressions used quite a lot, but everybody, most organizations, are very invested in the training that they do to end sexual harassment. They can say we have a policy, where there are procedures, although Kate has explained how complex and confusing they can be, and we do training. 30 years of work around looking at the training to end sexual harassment suggests quite strongly that it has not been effective in changing behaviour and changing culture. In fact, if it had, we wouldn't be here doing this work today. So we have issued some guidelines on what effective training looks like on ending sexual harassment. Now, during the time of COVID, you mentioned COVID, Kate, so let me just quickly say on that, I think there's been a real, very welcome highlighting of the dangers and risks of domestic violence during lockdown that has affected so many countries and so many people across the world. And that is welcome. I don't want to undermine that in any way. What's also true is that sexual harassment has not stopped during this period. People are still working, whether they are health workers and essential workers and key workers, or whether they are people who are now working remotely from home, as many of us are. And sexual harassment continues in that time, and we think we need to start to uncover what that looks like and think about how that's addressed during these rather difficult and new situations we find ourselves in. And in that respect, Kate, I just want to pick up, you mentioned the new Ilo Convention C190. It has an extremely helpful reformulation of what we mean by the world of work, which I quickly want to flag with you because it's broad and it's encompassing, and I think it's extremely pertinent to the conditions and climate where most of us are working now. It talks about violence and harassment in the world of work, and it includes places where we work, so physical environments, It includes when we're taking breaks. It includes when we're traveling or doing training. It includes work-related communications, accommodation if it's provided by employers, and commuting to and from work. It's a very different way of thinking about where we work and how we work. So that's the bigger context in which I'd like to respond, Kate, to your work. And I won't go over what you've said because you've given a good comprehensive review. I want to make a few other points, if I may. Firstly, I think what your series of surveys and your national inquiry has shown is that if you're serious about tackling sexual harassment, you have to be in it for the long haul. We have to dump, we have to reject, we have to forego the language of low-hanging fruit and easy wins. We have to be committed to the hard and long-term work of ending and eliminating and eradicating this human rights violation. Secondly, I want to say, be ready to deal with discomfort. I'm sure that the findings of your surveys were not comfortable. I'm sure they uncovered all sorts of things that made people feel unhappy, angry, embarrassed, defensive. Deal with it and find a way to hear the voices of critique and those stories of pain and trauma and harm. I also welcome, Kate, that you have messaged very strongly that ending sexual harassment is everybody's business. The language we've used to talk about that is we talk about collective responsibility and collective ownership of the project of change and elimination. And so I want to welcome and talk about the meshing of those messages. Thank you for that. I also think the inquiry has provided a mechanism, an example, Kate, of how the voices of victims and survivors are critical to shaping our responses and our prevention work. We have to hear from those who have been on the front line, who know what processes do and don't work and how it impacts them, to think about how we improve our work. I want also to recognise and welcome the central position of unwelcomeness in defining sexual harassment. In our international conversations, we find that's still a work in progress. And that consent has often been the go-to concept rather than unwelcomeness. And if there's time later, if there's interest, we can talk about why they are different. I'd just like to make a recommendation, if I may. Myself, Kate, your data has been extremely valuable to you, and I think it's allowed some unpicking to understand intersectional experiences. I welcome your disaggregation of data by Aboriginal and Torres Islanders, Straits Islanders, and disability and LGBT considerations. I think if we're serious about elimination, we have to keep an eye on victim and survivor experiences, but we also need to look at the perpetrator stories. We know that most are male, and that is, I think that repeats in all research that has been done. But I think we need to look also at who they are specifically, the direction of travel in terms of who harasses whom, what their experiences are of procedures and laws and so on. Do they feel somehow safe? We know that perpetrators move around from one organisation to another. We have to track and stop this sort of predation. Those are probably the most important points I wanted to make back to you. I realise there's a timing issue, but I just want to say I think that the work you've done in Australia is part of the bigger global discussion around what will make an effective difference. What do promising practices look like? I'm hesitant to say best practices. It suggests we can never improve. I prefer to talk about promising. And I hope that not only does your work have traction in Australia, as you've already suggested, but that we learn from it internationally. I think it meshes very well with the messages and the learning that we're having at the UN. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Purna. That was fantastic reflections, and I think you well know when we started this piece of work, you were this perfect international sort of conduit for all these different experiences, and you've been an incredible support to our inquiry the whole way through, as well as a mutual journey woman with me. I am getting some fantastic questions have come through to us, Purna. So, and I, as you were talking, I was also coming up with my own questions. So what I thought I would do is perhaps I'll perhaps go straight to one, given that this webinar has been developed and so just for participants to know, Purna and I will both be kind of answering these questions in discussion, but this webinar has been supported by our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and is being attended by people at missions across the world, which is really great for us. So one of the questions was, how can DFAT, which is the abbreviation, Purna, if you can't work out, of our department, work on the ground with other countries to progress eliminating sexual harassment locally in those countries? And I'll make some reflections, but I'm interested, Purna, in you thinking about that as well, because when we did the work, there was no question that the fact that this was a global problem, but also a local problem in Australia, and the fact that we could share and learn from other countries was a very important factor. I think Australia likes to both be a leader and also be part of that global community. And so that travel that I was doing was for other different purposes, but there's no question that our diplomatic efforts do prioritise promoting gender equality and promoting women's rights. Our Minister for Women now and before has really prioritised that. So as I was doing the work, whenever I travelled, people were incredibly interested in the inquiry. And in fact, the idea of this webinar came about because, you know, I'd hoped this year I would be travelling a bit to visit those posts, but that just hasn't and isn't going to happen. So how could we help those posts share, both learn as Australians, but also share within their countries? And I am really interested to work, and I'm going to be working with Julie-Ann as well, to think about how can we convert, how can they be sharing, how can they adapt our findings. I'm interested, given that your central role has been, and you've been an amazing resource for us to say, this, you know, I know you're in Iceland at a really amazing conference, because I remember staying up at night to live stream it while you were there. What do you think our posts in the different countries can do to help move the conversation about sexual harassment? And some of those countries will be interested and some will not be thinking about this issue at all. Have you got any thoughts on how our diplomats can share this work, but also some of your work as well?
Thank you, Kate. I think your colleagues at DFAT have been a great support and resource to us too. Let me just tell you and the participants in the webinar some of the things that diplomats have been doing at the UN, and then I'll come to the in-country potential. I think what Metoo, I talked about Metoo being the immediate prompt for my role being created, and for a shift in international discussion around sexual harassment, but also sexual violence more broadly. And it came inside the UN, and it was uncomfortable. What member states did also at that time was they set up an organisation, a group of member states, which became a lobbying and a watching and monitoring group on the UN in terms of its work around sexual harassment, and it was called the Group of Friends to Eliminate Sexual Harassment. It started in New York, but I believe it's being replicated in other centres, and I know that Australia has been an active member of that group. It's been an extremely well attended series of meetings, probably the fastest growing. There are several groups of friends of different topics. It's been possibly the fastest growing group at the UN over the last couple of years. And so I think that sort of rallying and mobilizing of states together to shift the discussion and the work and playing a significant part of that has been one thing. On the local level, more local national level, there are different initiatives in different countries to do different pieces of work that can shift the debate. You mentioned the Iceland meeting last year. That was an incredibly valuable convening of activist researchers in an intersectional discussion around what comes next from this movement. I think those sorts of initiatives are really important. I would say what DFAT and your colleagues and the diplomats with whom you work can do is to encourage and to support local learning. We don't have sufficient data. I read you a few statistics. We're looking and we're watching and we're following, but I'm afraid resources do need to be committed for this work. And I think if that sort of encouragement can be given, research costs money. The most important sector that will make a difference, and we know this again from research, and that will be on the front line for people experiencing sexual harassment, is the sector, women's organizations who support victims and survivors of violence. They need to have safe and predictable funding to do their work and to be effective supports for those who have experienced violence or harassment. So I think advocacy on that level by your diplomats would be extremely valuable. And I think an encouragement to be creative about local ways in which to learn from victims and survivors about what needs to be done and how to do it. I will just add a word that isn't very perhaps popular in the sector where I work, in the UN and in our expert context and difference, is humility. I think each country, each context has to develop strategies and procedures and methods that work locally and that have meaning to victims and survivors, particular voices least often heard. And for me, I'm talking particularly about intersectional perspectives, experiences, being privileged as the core of this work. And as your work has, as I mentioned before, tried to pull out a little bit around Aboriginal experiences, those with disabilities and LGBT, I think we all need to say we haven't done enough around learning from and privileging those voices and experiences. So I think some reflection on that from Australia, how you've been able to start that, what more you need to do, and how you learn from those on the front line, are conversations that could really move things forward elsewhere.
Fantastic answer. You were such the right person to ask that question to. And as I'm watching and listening to you, Purna, I guess I'll share with participants that your time at the UN is coming near to an end. So at the end of August, I know you finish your role. But one thing that I would give a shout out to everyone participating is that as you go on to whatever your next adventure is, the amazing expertise that you've developed in the time that you're at UN Women, I know I for one will make sure that I keep in contact, because the potential is you could be available to also work with some of those other countries. So I hope this is a bit of a touting for work for you, Purna. You'll be available. I don't know whether you will be, but I'm offering you anyway.
You're making me laugh. Thank you, Kate. That's very kind.
So other questions. So these are all great questions, but I'm just picking the order, and then we have another at least about 10 or 15, so we should be able to get through them. So one of the other questions, and this really definitely came in at the time you were talking in more detail about Tarana Burke's work and Metoo. And some people in Australia might know that Tarana Burke came to Australia in November of last year. She was the winner of the Sydney Peace Prize in 2019, and she accepted it with Tracy Spicer, and recognising the momentum that was created in particularly the recent social media explosion, but also recognising that long-term work that Tarana had done. So the question was, how can we keep the support and attention galvanized by Metoo going and harness it to take concrete steps to eliminate sexual harassment? So Purna, like before, I'll have a go at that and then pass to you. One of the things I would say, when Metoo as a social media phenomenon happened, there was, I think you know that I worked for 20 years as an employment lawyer, but with a specialty in discrimination, and from that I started early 90s. I did so many discrimination cases, and particularly sexual harassment cases. And there was a tangible difference in the conversation. So I'd had 25 years working in this area, seeing the same cases that we still see, but also seeing the public conversation was generally not taking the issue seriously. And so, I mean, I personally noticed that when that 5th of October 2017, I had been overseas. I came home, I hopped off a plane and my phone was going crazy. And that was the Harvey Weinstein story that hit. But what then happened in Australia between that time and Christmas was that everyone's Facebook page, but also dinner party conversations started to talk about sexual harassment at work in particular. And what at the time I consistently said was it had raised awareness about the prevalence, as in not in a statistic, but actually, you know, men saying my wife has had this happen for the first time. You know, I spoke to the wives who all said he's just never asked. Of course it had happened, but he was like, I can't believe. So how common it was, how complex the silence, you know, and how people didn't talk about it. But then also how harmful it was. And that really made a difference. But I remember at the time saying a social media movement isn't going to solve a really complex social problem. But if I think about my career and the role that media broadly has on spotlighting issues, I do think even in the old days before social media, a case reported in the paper with graphic detail did make people uncomfortable, did make people realise what was acceptable and not. And so I'd say in Australia, since that 2017 moment, which could have been viewed as something just in the States, we have had sort of a rolling engagement. There's lots of conversations in Australia about whether our defamation laws are silencing, but some watching this would know that at the start in June of this year, there was reporting of sexual harassment involving our High Court that re-engaged a Me Too kind of conversation. So my response to that question is that that how do we keep it going is that this it feels like we're at a tipping point. We're getting evidence, we're getting things like our inquiry, we're getting still reporting, we're getting workplaces engaging, and it's just the accumulation of all these things, but also recognising we haven't got the answers. It is, as you've said, long-term work. But we do now have the ability, for all its downsides, as our e-safety commissioner would point out, you know, that it shows up all the flaws in human nature and all the misogyny that we have. It also does empower voices to speak that haven't been heard or allowed to speak. And so my sense about this, how do we keep it going? My optimism is, well, it has kept going. It's almost 3, you know, it's 2.5 years later, and you and I are, you know, drawing an international crowd to talk about the topic of sexual harassment. What are your perspectives on keeping that momentum going?
Thank you, Kate. Those are some really interesting reflections you just shared. I also want to endorse what you're saying about the importance of the Me Too movement. I know there's been a great debate about whether Me Too has been a movement or a moment. I actually think it's been both. I think it's been a moment that's been created by a movement, and that moment isn't fleeting, but it's not automatically with us forever. And the questioner is quite right to say, to suggest that actually it takes work for that to continue. And what does that work look like? Let me just say what it did, and I think those include lasting impacts. I don't think there's hardly anybody in any organisation, university, company, across the world who can say now, as they may have said 5 years ago, they don't know what sexual harassment is, and it doesn't happen. I think that would be a truly remarkable position for someone to say and try and defend now. I think that has really changed. I also think what has profoundly changed, which is extremely important, is that the expectations for a safe work environment have shifted. My generation, generations before me, you know, I'm quite old now, we always thought and we always knew that this was something you put up with. It's part of life. I don't think that's the view anymore. I don't think there is a more passive acceptance that this is an inevitability. I think those expectations have shifted, and I think that means that the demands on our corporate sectors, our employers, our universities will be different. The expectations are different on them and what they should do. So I think that those are already dynamics which will be maintained, and so the sort of acquiescence to sexual harassment and its persistence in life is a whole different ballgame now than what it used to be even 3 years ago. Like you say, it's only 2.5 years. I think we have to do a couple of quite tricky things. One, I think the Metoo movement and what's happening now with Black Lives Matter, I'll draw another parallel in a moment, has really changed the way we think about how change happens. I'm talking as a former academic, used to teach this, and as an activist who's done a lot of this work. This has been a spontaneous movement where people have never met each other. They aren't funded by any donor. They don't have a leadership and an organization and an office and a postal address and a phone number and an email. They do have a hashtag, and they have significantly and forever changed the nature of public discussion and action on sexual harassment. So I think we need to learn from how that has happened and try and make sure that the nature of what becomes effective in terms of social change is something that stays with us and that we galvanize and learn from it for the future. Also linking those two issues, Me Too and Black Lives Matter, I think the work is on us to understand the links between different forms of inequality and discrimination. The underlying concerns that have been raised by both Me Too and Black Lives Matter has been unnamed, acquiesced to, inadequately challenged forms of inequality and discrimination that have become part of the fabric of everyday life. And I think it's our challenge as policymakers, as practitioners, legislators, to join those dots between different forms of inequality, partly because they are intersectional and nobody lives single issue lives, may I quote the great Audre Lorde, but also because if we're going to be effective about ending these sorts of inequality, this harassment, the racism, we have to understand the linkages between them and make them end. So I think we have to keep the media, you talked about stories emerging, I think they will continue to emerge. We have to keep the media interested in this. The fact that it wasn't only social media that enabled sexual harassment to come onto the agenda, but also some parts of traditional media. That's a significant change. Historically, I would say in many countries, media have seen sexual violence and sexual harassment as somehow titillating and entertainment news. There is a shift. It's not complete and it's not deep, but there is something of a shift to seeing this as something that is inexcusable, intolerable, and has to be addressed. And I think we have to keep the work on for that. Legislators have to keep watching and talking about implementation of the laws that they have implemented, passed, or improvement in those provisions. Stories will keep emerging. Our task is to keep those who speak safer than they have been in the past, because the cost of speaking still remains unacceptably high. People lose their jobs. People have been killed. You know, a young woman, schoolgirl in Bangladesh, was killed for speaking about sexual harassment from her headmaster. We cannot be flippant about the telling of stories and the sharing of accounts. This doesn't come cost-free, it comes at a price, and we have to work to reduce that price. I think a lot of this is about political pressure, organising pressure, funding. You talked about DFAT. You know, there is a chance to fund the organisations who are, you know, you get seen as a nuisance for raising these issues. You get seen as troublemakers. You get seen as not good friends to those in power. And I think there is an obligation to support those who are raising challenging questions and making big demands for change. And those can become political and electoral issues too. Let's see if that's what happens in different parts of the world. Certainly in some places, politicians are being held to account on their work, their own practices, behaviours, and their commitment to these areas of work. And lastly, on an international level, since I'm from the UN, it is to say every country that has signed up to the convention I mentioned earlier, CEDAW, reports on their progress on implementing its contents. They report to the United Nations and say, here's what we've done, here's what our difficulties have been, here's where we've made progress. And those reports really ought to address sexual harassment more than they have done. And the other thing that people need to know is that non-governmental bodies, experts, NGOs, activists, academics can also make reports to those committees. And those are systems of monitoring and accountability that can have pressure, that can bring change, that can shift the conversation about what needs to be done. So I would recommend that those international mechanisms are also continued they continue to be used as a point of leverage and pressure.
Fantastic. And you're giving me ideas for our embassies who are asking what can they do in country. And part of me is thinking, no matter where you are, you could do a scan of what's the position on sexual harassment. And one of the sources could be looking at the CEDAW reviews to see what is said, because you can look at that for Australia as well. And there's actually comments about our inquiry being really positive. So our review was positive in that sense, but different countries. And I know that's why we're so enthusiastic to get our candidate, Natasha Stott-Despoja, onto that committee, not only because it's amazing, internationally important work, but because it really does, that sharing of experiences will benefit Australia as well as other countries. So I might ask you something that has come up very consistently for me when I've done a range of presentations in Australia. I would say in the participant groups we get, when we talk about the workplace practices in particular, in that framework that I showed briefly, probably the main starting point when people talk about sexual harassment and start trying to engage on how they want to change is they talk about training. There's no question. I'd say that would be almost every conversation involves, what does the training look like? Because I mean, I might seem confusing sometimes when people tell me about their training, and well, what we need to do is get these old barristers, and they need to attend the 1 hour training session, and as if that will change things. I know I've been really influenced by the work you and UN Women have done and the expertise that you've brought in on the training. I've also, been groupie following you because you work with Catherine McKinnon, and I'm of the age that I was at university when Catherine McKinnon was inventing the legal term of sexual harassment. So I'm interested in your training, and then I'm mildly interested of what it's like working with Catherine McKinnon. And I know you're doing some webinars coming up, so everyone must follow Purna on Twitter and register to hear Catherine's views. But can you give me kind of some sense on training, but also just groupie kind of comments on Catherine McKinnon?
You made me laugh, Kate. Thank you for that. The training issue is, I think it's really fundamental to how and in what way we make change, and whether we're serious about it. What we did was we recognized that everybody's doing training and wants to do training. And actually it was from a compatriot of yours, Paula McDonald, meeting her at an event, that I started to think more seriously about the nature of training, and learnt about evaluations of training over many years, over several decades, consistently across time and place, showing that it hadn't been effective. And I needed to think about why, because I think all of the organizations we work for, well, probably all, but certainly most, are quite proud of doing training. It's almost like, look, we've got policy, we have a procedure for reporting, and we train all our staff. And so I started to look at it a bit more and think about why. And then we brought in Professor Liz Kelly from the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit in the UK to do a review for us of how training has been done and why the literature is saying it hasn't been effective, and to propose some guidelines for more effective training. Just to summarize, a lot of training has been done online, has been checkbox, tick box responses, might be, as you mentioned, an hour's engagement, and then there's no follow-up. The other thing that struck me was that the content has been what I call the 3 Ps. Here's a policy, here's a procedure, and here's prohibited behavior. So this is like a broadcast. And the job of the trainee is to take this in and then move on to what's next. And we joked about it at a meeting. I was at a global meeting around sexual harassment. We used to joke about this sort of tick box type training, saying, oh, it's the sort of thing you can do when you're watching TV or ironing. Just look up every now and again and tick a box and move on to the next page. It doesn't touch you. And if we recognize that sexual harassment isn't simply about a behavior or two, it's about a culture, it's about how we understand inequality, how we relate to each other, how we think about what it is to be male and female, who is sexually available, or deemed to be sexually available, who is considered to have rights, in inverted commas, of sexual access to others. How does race play a part in constructing who is considered to be sexually available, who is believed, who is incredible? Those are really fundamental issues about how we live our everyday lives, and they cannot be addressed in an hour online. And so what we're talking about is training needs to be more long-term, a longer duration. It has to be face-to-face. That's how you can really deal with the complexity of the issues that are raised. It has to be scenario-based. Look at particular cases. What would you do in these situations? And I'll come to how we've used those in trying this training. And it has to be, we've said it, respectful of and drawing on experiential knowledge. Rather than being organizational or managerially led, it has to start from the experiences of those on the ground. And lastly, it has to be bespoke. It has to be training that is constructed for and fit the context in which you're looking for change behavior. So training that works for a hairdresser's enterprise will not work on an oil rig, may not be what we need at the UN or what you do in a university. It has to fit the context. On a bigger scale, what Liz Kelly proposed in terms of a bigger process of change was something that had three elements, of which training was just a part. One was to do what she called a series of round tables, where to ensure that you have a collective commitment to who you want to be as an organization. You have discussions about shared values and mission. And so you've got everybody committed to this vision of who you should be. Then you do an audit of that organization to say, well, here are the conditions and circumstances that either allow sexual harassment to happen or mitigate effectively dealing with it. And what you then do is develop training that takes you from this situation to where you want to be. And so you've got everybody working on this collective ownership project. And then that training is bespoke. It is scenario based, so scenarios that fit that organization. And we've set a minimum of 2 days. And that senior leadership and entry-level staff should all be going through the same experience. There's a lot more detail about it. We've done things called conceptual mapping. If we had more time, I would go into it, but a lot of that is in the publication. I will just say that we tried this, that we developed this, or Liz developed it and wrote it up as a paper, and then we talked about trying it out to see, whether we could do it. And I've been part of delivering this model twice. Once in East and Southern Africa for a range of UN agencies. And then we were invited, and Liz and I did this together, to the UN office in Vienna, where we had an incredible day, learning from the first experience in Nairobi, an incredible couple of days of work around this. And I'm quite convinced that this is an effective way of doing the training. We haven't had the opportunity to try out that bigger audit vision training model. That's a big commitment. If anybody wants to do that in an organization, I would love to work on that with you. But we did learn, and I would have liked to try out another version before finishing at the UN Women, but it's not likely with the travel restrictions and the inability to meet in person. But I think there is something there in that model, and in that that very intense, experience-led, scenario-based, bigger conversation around inequality and discrimination that has a lot of promise.
Fantastic. Now I'm aware we're coming close to the end of our session, Purna. So I will keep in contact with you and ask the 10 other questions I have. And I'll also just acknowledge there is a terrific stream of questions having come through here. So I am going to, at the end, in a minute, but I'll give you 1 minute to say anything you would like to say before I close. And I'll just sort of promptly answer the last question and then close this session. So Purna, before I, completely, is there any other remarks you want to say just before I wrap this up? And I'm sure it's just the continuation of a conversation.
Okay, thank you. That's a great opportunity to round up, and let me thank you also for a really rich and lively discussion. I appreciate being here. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the thing that I take away from this work, and also 30 years work on violence and in human rights and 10 years on race equality before that, is that a whole set of commitments and promises have been made to women and to all victims and survivors of violence, harassment and abuse, which is to end this experience, to hold perpetrators to account, and to change the nature of discrimination and inequality in the world. These can't be rhetorical commitments. These can't be also about reputation management or looking good or maintaining your profit margin. And I'm picking up on a question by Chris Knight at Sir Optimus International about the consequences for those who've been alleged to have committed sexual harassment. I don't think we have honoured the promises we have made to victims and survivors. I don't think we have earned their trust and their confidence in the systems and procedures we have developed for their benefit. And so I think for me, the only way we will do that is to put them at the centre of our work, and that includes us. And when I say them, you know, many of us in this conversation will have been subjected to this form of harassment. And so I think we need to earn that trust, place them at the centre, ask them what would make a difference, listen to what they say and stop talking, learn. And I think that way we can respect and deliver the covenant and promises that are pertinent on this area. I look forward to working with you, Kate, in whatever capacity, and your colleagues and others online to take this agenda forward and to make real the promises that have been made and the commitments that obtain nationally and internationally on this topic. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Purna. And I'm so grateful you joined us. I knew that this would be a really rich conversation, and it absolutely has delivered in spades. And it also really inspires me to think of what we can do, and I'm very optimistic about that. I'd also like to thank all the participants online for your questions, for your engagement. I know there is an amazing group of people out there. I encourage you to look on our website and social media and follow that there are other webinars on the topic, but also look at Purna's resources and her. Follow her because you will see lots of other fantastic things. We will be posting this, as I said, in the next week, this recording online, so you can, I would encourage you and love you to reshare it. In closing, what I was going to say is one of the questions that came through is, what are the key messages that we should give our partner governments about the report? And Purna, you've been such a great person talking about all these things, but I guess my commitment to all of you is that Julie-Ann Guivarra, our ambassador for gender equality, who came back from Spain to become grounded in Australia, as it turns out, has committed, we both together are really keen to help give our embassies, but also other country and other governments some resources to understand what is useful out of this report in other contexts. So I know Julie-Ann and I will get together. The package might include a copy of this webinar, but also give some key themes to help you out there. I know my terrific staff, thank you, Georgia, Lauren, Claire and Amy, have done a lot to put this together, and Claire in particular has come from DFAT, so has a very finely tuned eye on what might be useful for out of Australia experiences. So thank you very much. I appreciate you joining. I appreciate those of you who have stayed up late, and also those of you who've got up early. And I look forward to seeing you perhaps on another a similar webinar. Thank you.